In the soft hush of the desert night, the sands of Egypt shift quietly beneath the stars, far from the bustling modern world, and long after the last torch was extinguished in the great temples, echoes of a different kind still whisper through the Nile Valley. Stories, half-truths, fragments, and rumors cling to the broken stones like dust, too stubborn to fade. You see, not all pharaohs were noble. Not all were builders of peace or wise in their rule. Some were feared, some were ruthless, and some, it is said, were the cruelest leaders Egypt ever knew. Tonight, as you settle into the calm of your room, we journey back through time, not to explore the glory of golden tombs or the wonders of pyramids, but to listen quietly to the forgotten voices of those who lived under the shadows of power. Not every dynasty was remembered fondly. Not every ruler was carved in a stone with reverence. There were those whose names were scratched out, their statues toppled, their memories cursed. And yet, here we are, quietly wondering what made them so feared. It begins not with the loud crash of armies or the clash of steel, but with quiet decisions made behind palace doors. The cold gaze of a ruler who believed in divine right, who saw himself as a god walking among mortals. And when a man believes he is a god, what becomes of those who disobey him? Long before Cleopatra captured the Roman world attention, and before Ramses left his name etched across 100 temples, there were rulers whose grip on power was marked by paranoia, punishment, and a hunger for control. Ancient Egypt, despite its elegance, was also a place of secrets, court conspiracies, and harsh punishments. The cruelest pharaohs didn't always raise their voice. They didn't need to. A raised eyebrow from the throne could doom a family. A whispered command in the hallway could decide the fate of a village. The people who lived under these rulers, scribes, servants, builders, and farmers, felt the weight of this cruelty not in grand, dramatic acts, but in quiet sufferings. Increased labor in the sun, higher grain taxes in times of drought, public humiliation for small mistakes. There were no news channels, no protest signs, just the silence of survival. Some stories still survive, faint and flickering like candlelight, like the tale of a high priest in Thebes who dared question the sacred rituals enforced by one particularly harsh pharaoh. His fate, his name erased from the temple walls, his family lands confiscated, and his burial denied. A cruel punishment in a land where the afterlife was more important than life itself. Imagine living in a world where being forgotten after death was worse than execution. In these next moments, we'll drift slowly through history, through dynasties both celebrated and feared. We'll meet pharaohs with cold eyes and quick tempers, rulers who transformed palaces into prisons, leaders who turned against their own advisors, who crushed uprisings with brute force, and who sacrificed peace for pride. But we'll also look beyond the thrones, at the people who had to navigate life under these rulers. What was it like to serve under a paranoid king? To work under the command of a pharaoh who trusted no one? One such ruler was said to inspect his guards at night, not for loyalty, but for fear. He believed that only those who feared him were loyal enough to stay close. There was a general, once beloved, who vanished from the record after a single disagreement. One day, he stood beside the pharaoh in the royal court. The next, he was simply gone. No burial, no mention, as if he'd never lived. That kind of silence speaks louder than words. Even the royal architects weren't safe. In one dynasty, a chief architect was buried alive in the foundations of a tomb, allegedly for revealing too much about the design. And yet, strangely, the tomb was never finished. Some say the workers refused to complete it, believing the land itself had been cursed by the cruel decision. But cruelty doesn't always come with rage. Sometimes it's cold and calculated. A ruler might raise taxes not because he needed wealth, but because he wanted to test the limits of obedience. He might order public festivals, not to celebrate the gods, but to display his own power. And sometimes he might offer gifts to the people, not from kindness, but to see who would dare refuse. There's an ancient papyrus buried in a museum vault, almost forgotten. It speaks of a pharaoh whose punishments were so harsh that even the scribes hesitated to write them down. Entire families punished for the mistakes of one son. Fields burned after failed prayers. This was no tale for entertainment. This was a warning passed down in quiet corners of the old temples. And still, in the midst of it all, the river flowed. The Nile watched it all unfold. The coronations, the trials, the betrayals, and the exiles. The river has carried secrets for thousands of years. Sometimes, when the floodwaters rose too high, it wasn't nature that caused it, but sabotage, punishment. Messages from the palace delivered not with words, but with disaster. Some of these rulers are still buried beneath the sands, their tombs untouched, their names too dangerous to speak. Not out of fear today, but out of a strange respect for the power they held, even in cruelty. The ancient Egyptians believed in balance, in Ma'at, the principle of order, justice, and harmony. But when a pharaoh rejected that balance, when he ruled through fear and force, the land itself seemed to change. Crops failed, temples cracked, whispers filled the markets. But why would people follow such a ruler? Why would they not rise up? The answer is simple. Fear, yes, but also hope. In Egypt, the pharaoh was more than a king. He was the bridge between the gods and the people. To reject him was to risk your afterlife, your children's future, and the wrath of both man and God. So most bowed their heads and worked harder, prayed louder, and hoped that the next pharaoh might be kinder. But tonight, we're not talking about the kind ones. Not yet. Tonight is about the pharaohs whose names made scribes tremble, whose faces on stone were chiseled off not by time, but by protest, leaders who demanded worship, but gave only fear. Some of them were born into power, others seized it, but all of them left behind a mark, a scar, on the pages of history. And just as the sun sets beyond the desert, we will slowly follow the path these rulers walked. From lonely halls of power to silent tombs built in haste. From brutal decisions to whispers in the dark. But there is one name, still, that historians hesitate to speak. A pharaoh so feared, so cruel, that even his own priests plotted against him. His legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was buried, erased, and left for time to forget. And yet, not everything stays buried forever. What really happened in his final days? Why did the builders of his tomb refuse to complete it? Why did the records suddenly go silent, only to resume under a new ruler? One whose very first order was to undo everything the last had done. In the stillness of history, sometimes the cruelest voices echo the loudest. And as we drift deeper into the forgotten scrolls, the quiet ruins, and the fading footprints in the sand, the truth begins to stir. We're not just studying kings, we're unearthing fear itself. But to understand the full weight of his rule, we must go back further still, to the day he took the throne. And that is where the day he took the throne was not marked by cheers or celebration. There were no dancers in the streets, no festivals at the temple gates. Instead, there was a silence that wrapped around Thebes like a thick fog. The old king had died suddenly, and no one quite knew how. Some whispered of illness. Others, in hushed tones, spoke of poison. But no one dared ask too many questions. In ancient Egypt, when a pharaoh died under strange circumstances, the wise learned to speak less and bow more. The new ruler, a young man barely past 20, entered the throne room with eyes that didn't seem to blink. His name was Sedekar, though few dared use it aloud. He had been a second son, not expected to rule. The older brother, beloved by the people and deeply spiritual, had died mysteriously just a year before their father. Sedekar, quiet and watchful, had studied court politics from the shadows. While his brother trained with priests and debated philosophy, Sedekar watched the guards, the scribes, and the grain collectors. He learned who feared punishment more than dishonor, who could be bribed, who could be threatened. His first act as pharaoh was not a speech or a royal feast. It was a purge. Within days, the old vizier vanished. The chief scribe was stripped of his titles and never seen again. Several priests, too, disappeared or were reassigned to remote temples far from the capital. New faces arrived, young, untested men whose only qualification seemed to be loyalty. There were no announcements, no trials, just absence. The people began to notice changes quickly. The granaries, once carefully measured to ensure fair distribution, were suddenly overtaxed. Farmers were required to give more than ever, even as the harvest shrank. Public works projects were ordered, not to honor the gods, but to glorify the new ruler. Statues were carved not in his image, but in images of the gods, bearing features that suspiciously resembled Sedeker himself. He wasn't just king now. He wanted to be worshipped. His eyes were always watching, or so it seemed. A new network of informants emerged in the villages. Neighbors began reporting neighbors. Even children were taught in schools to sing hymns that praised the divine ruler and encouraged them to speak up if anyone questioned his greatness. Fear sank into the soil like water after a flood. It seeped into homes, into the markets, into every quiet conversation. One scribe, whose diary was later discovered in a collapsed storage room near Luxor, described how he was once summoned to the palace for incorrect accounting. He expected to be fined or maybe whipped, but instead he was brought to a small chamber deep beneath the court, where the walls were lined with strange symbols, unfamiliar even to him, a man who had spent his life reading old texts. There, in the dim torchlight, a tall priest whispered that the pharaoh had eyes in every corner of the kingdom, that Sedeker's spirit traveled in dreams, that he knew what was said in secret. The scribe was released, unharmed, but he never spoke a single unkind word again. Sedeker also introduced something Egypt had never quite seen before, a public reward for betrayal. If someone reported a traitor of the state, they could earn land, status, or even a place in the palace. Suddenly, the poor found new purpose, not through labor, but through spying. Families were torn apart by suspicion. Brothers turned on brothers, servants on masters, and each time, Sedeker watched with quiet satisfaction. Temples that once held ceremonies for fertility, rain, and rebirth were instead repurposed. Priests now recited new prayers, ones written by the king's own chosen scribes. The old gods were not forgotten, but they were overshadowed. Sedeker was slowly making himself the center of spiritual life, forcing even the most faithful to question who really held power, the gods or their king. Even the tombs began to change. Where once they were carved with images of journeys to the afterlife, they now bore scenes of the pharaoh's divine judgments. One tomb showed villagers bowing in fear as Sedeker, seated beside Osiris, passed sentence on souls. It wasn't just a message to the dead, it was a warning to the living. Despite all of this, some tried to resist. Quietly, carefully, a group of senior builders began leaving small symbols behind the walls of Sedeker's temple, marks of the old gods, meant to protect the workers and counter the energy they believed the pharaoh was invoking. These markings were never meant to be found. But one morning, Sedeker ordered the destruction of the eastern wall of the temple. He claimed a vision from the gods had told him it must be redone. What he found beneath the stone enraged him. The workers were rounded up, not just those assigned to the temple, but all stonemasons in the region. The punishment was swift and silent. None of them were seen again. Their families were relocated, their names erased from the worker logs. And the next generation of builders worked faster, quieter, with their heads down. In private, the court physicians noticed something strange too. The pharaoh's health, while outwardly strong, began to show signs of wear. He rarely slept. He muttered to himself in court. His hands, once steady, developed a slight tremble. One physician dared suggest he take time away from the throne. He was never heard from again. A new physician was appointed, one trained not in medicine, but in obedience. But not all the royal advisors were blind. One young court official, Tafari, had grown up under Sedeker's reign. His father had been a grain collector who died in the early purges. Tafari had survived by keeping quiet and learning fast. But he never forgot. As he rose in the ranks, gaining the pharaoh's trust, he began to collect information. He spoke to silent guards. He bribed desperate servants. He read restricted texts under torchlight while the palace slept. What he discovered frightened him. Sedekier's cruelty was not random. It was ritual, carefully calculated. Every act of public punishment, every tax hike, every exile, it was all part of a larger design. A pattern, a belief that only through fear and sacrifice could a ruler control chaos and become immortal. Sedekier wasn't simply cruel. He believed he was reshaping Egypt itself, stripping away weakness to create a stronger kingdom. But stronger for whom? Tafari knew he couldn't act alone. He began contacting former officials who had survived the early purges. Some were in hiding, others in exile. Slowly, quietly, they began to form a network, one that stretched from the palace kitchens to the border outposts. They didn't call themselves rebels. They called themselves the Balance, a quiet name for a quiet hope that Egypt could be restored, not through violence, but through silence, patience, precision. And so they waited. But Sedekier, ever watchful, had begun to suspect cracks in his foundation. He ordered new measures, more spies, random audits of household prayers, weekly loyalty rituals. The court grew tenser. The people grew wearier. Even the Nile, in those years, flooded less. Crops failed. Animals died. Some began to whisper that Maat, the balance of the world, was breaking. Sedekier didn't care. He had plans. Plans for a monument unlike any before it. A temple carved into the cliffs beyond the Valley of the Kings. Not to house the gods, but to house himself. A living temple, where he would be worshipped not in death, but in life. It would be his greatest legacy, his eternal throne. And yet, deep beneath the palace, in a narrow hallway sealed to most, Tafari stood alone, holding a scroll he was never meant to see. A scroll that detailed something even darker than ritual cruelty. A secret chamber, a hidden chamber beneath the planned temple. One not meant for ceremonies, but for sacrifices. A place where Sedekier believed he could trade human lives for divine immortality. Tafari knew then the time for waiting was over. But before he could act, something happened that would change everything. Something even Sedekier couldn't have predicted. And it began with a single sound echoing through the stone halls. A sound that would bring the walls of the palace and the rule of the cruelest pharaoh closer to collapse. But that part of the story is still waiting to be told. The sound that echoed through the stone halls that night was not loud. It wasn't a shout or a trumpet or the thunder of horses. It was a quiet knock, a soft, deliberate tapping at the entrance of the royal scribe's chamber. At first, no one thought anything of it. Knocks were common. Servants came and went. But this knock came at an hour when no one was supposed to be awake. The halls had already been cleared, the torches dimmed, and the guards were in their rotations. And yet, the knock came again, steady, careful, almost like it was counting. The royal scribe, an older man named Munef, rose from his mat, pulling a thin linen over his shoulders. He had served 3 pharaohs in his life. He had seen prosperity, fear, and quiet rebellion. But never had he felt a chill like the one that crept down his spine that night. When he opened the door, no one was there. Just a single folded scrap of papyrus resting on the floor, weighed down by a small stone. He picked it up, glanced both ways down the corridor, and stepped back inside. The note contained no greeting, no signature. Just one line. Asterisk, the chamber beneath the temple is ready. The blood moon rises in 4 nights. Asterisk, Munef didn't sleep the rest of the night. Far across the palace, Tafari stood on the roof of a quiet annex. He watched the stars and listened to the wind. His hands were trembling. The note he had ordered delivered was now in motion, and there was no taking it back. He knew the consequences, but what he didn't know was how much time he had left. Sedekier had grown more erratic, more ambitious, and more dangerous. 3 days earlier, Sedekier had ordered his chief architect to begin carving a massive staircase beneath the cliffside temple. The workers had asked no questions, as always, but some of them had started to whisper. They were digging deep into the limestone, reinforcing walls not with prayer carvings, but with strange symbols, symbols that didn't belong to any known Egyptian script, symbols that made the older workers turn pale. Some had refused to continue. They never returned home. Meanwhile, outside the palace, famine tightened its grip. Crops were failing. The river was late in its rise. Livestock were dying. But rather than offer aid or relief, Sedekar had responded by blaming the people. He claimed their faith was too weak, that they had angered the gods by doubting his divine will. So, he raised taxes again, took children for temple labor, demanded public displays of loyalty. In the villages, statues of Sedekar were forced into homes, sometimes replacing ancestral shrines. One farmer was reportedly executed for refusing to kneel during a procession. His family was never seen again. The people were growing restless, but carefully so. Egypt was not a land of open rebellion. It was a land of slow, quiet resistance, but still resistance. Within the palace walls, the balance, Tafari's silent network, grew bolder. Messages were passed in food baskets, behind tapestry seams, inside the handles of fans. Every hour, Tafari risked exposure. But he also gained more pieces of the puzzle. He learned the names of those working on the secret chamber. He learned that the sacrifices were not just rumors, but real, taken from distant villages, people chosen because no one would miss them. And he learned something even more terrifying. The pharaoh wasn't just seeking immortality. He was trying to bring something through. In the oldest texts, those buried deep beneath the temple libraries, there were references to ancient forces older than the gods that slept beneath the earth. Sedekar, obsessed with becoming more than mortal, had begun to believe he could awaken one of these beings. That by offering blood and building the temple precisely as the symbols instructed, he would unlock power no pharaoh had ever held before. Tafari, once a boy who had dreamed only of survival, now found himself at the heart of something darker than politics. Something ancient. He knew he had to act. But how do you fight a man worshipped as a god? A man surrounded by guards, walls, and spies? A man who believed the rules of life and death no longer applied to him? The answer, he decided, was not to strike directly, but to unravel him. The plan was simple in appearance, but dangerous in execution. First, the temple builders would fake an accident. A tunnel collapse, one that revealed forbidden markings, symbols considered cursed. Next, the scribes would begin to leak stories, quietly, of failed harvests and unnatural deaths near the new temple site. Then, a priest, secretly part of the balance, would refuse to bless the construction. Publicly, visibly, fear spreads quickly in a kingdom that runs on faith. And it worked at first, when the tunnel collapsed, killing 2 workers and revealing a wall of strange symbols. Word spread fast. The next day, a local priest declared the site cursed and was dragged from the market square in chains. But his message had already traveled. People began refusing to deliver materials to the site. Supplies slowed. Workers quit in the night. Whispers turned into quiet conversations. Even some in the palace began questioning the pharaoh's obsession. Sedekar responded with fury. He ordered the priest executed, the builders punished, and new materials brought in from farther regions. But the delays were enough. Tafari now had time to plan the second part of the rebellion. What he didn't know was that Sedekar had already begun the rituals in secret. Deep beneath the temple, in the lowest part of the new chamber, a stone altar had been constructed, a place not for offerings of bread or wine, but for blood. And Sedekar had already made his first sacrifice. The skies that night had turned strangely red, and a violent sandstorm swept across the region. People in the surrounding towns spoke of nightmares, of hearing voices in the wind, of waking with dried blood on their hands, and no memory of why. Something was shifting. Tafari knew he had to move faster. He arranged a midnight meeting with the surviving elders of the balance. They met in a crumbling crypt beneath the palace, once used to store ceremonial scrolls. There, by flickering oil lamps, he revealed what he had learned. The chamber, the sacrifices, the strange symbols that didn't match any known language. The plan now was no longer about resisting cruelty. It was about stopping something far worse from being unleashed. They decided on one final act: destroy the chamber. They would wait until the moon reached its highest point, 4 nights from now, just as the message had warned. That would be the night Sedekir completed his ritual. That would be the night to strike. But even as they planned, a pair of eyes watched from a crack in the stone above. A young kitchen boy, bribed by a palace guard loyal to Sedekir, had followed Tefari without being seen. And by the next morning, the pharaoh knew everything. Still, he said nothing. He allowed the plans to continue. Let the balance think they were safe. Then, on the night of the blood moon, he would have them all gathered in one place. He would sacrifice them himself and complete the ritual with their lives. That night was approaching fast, and none of them knew that the chamber below had already begun to hum, low and steady, like something beneath the earth was stirring, waiting, listening. The most feared pharaoh in Egypt's long, haunted history was no longer just building a tomb. He was building a doorway, and the next sound they heard might not be from this world at all. The night of the blood moon came slower than anyone expected. Time, it seemed, stretched in the palace like melted wax, soft, tense, unwilling to move. The stars hung low and quiet, and even the animals seemed to know something was wrong. Dogs didn't bark. Donkeys refused to pull carts. Birds stayed silent. The Nile ran dark, sluggish, almost reluctant. Tefari stood on the edge of the cliff, overlooking the half-finished temple, his cloak pressed tight against his frame by the cool desert wind. Below him, torches flickered around the scaffolding like fireflies, casting long shadows on the limestone walls. Workers had been dismissed early. Guards were stationed far out. Only a few chosen priests and trusted aides remained. Sedekir had ordered privacy. This part of the ritual was too important to be seen by anyone unworthy. But what the pharaoh didn't know, or at least hadn't yet acted on, was that the balance had already made their way inside. Tefari, along with Amunef the scribe and Merit, a temple healer with access to sacred herbs, had slipped in through a side tunnel used for transporting heavy stones. It was narrow and dangerous, but Tefari had mapped it carefully over weeks. Beneath their feet was the chamber, the altar, the markings, the place where Sedekir planned to trade human lives for eternal power. They had only one goal now: stop the ritual before it began. As they crept through the darkness, the air began to shift. It wasn't just dust and heat anymore. There was something else, something thicker, older, like the breath of a closed tomb. A scent of copper and ash clung to the stones. The walls pulsed slightly, as if the structure itself had started to come alive. Amunef reached out, touched the limestone, and pulled his hand back quickly. It was warm, not desert warm, but unnaturally warm, as if heat was rising from inside the earth. They pressed forward. Meanwhile, deep within the chamber, Sedekir stood before the altar wearing robes that shimmered with a strange sheen, woven with silver thread and embroidered symbols no one in Egypt had ever seen before. His crown was different too. Gone was the traditional cobra. In its place was a blackened disc with 7 spokes, a shape found only in the forbidden scrolls buried under the old temples. His eyes were wide, glassy, like he hadn't slept in days. Around him, 4 hooded figures stood silently. Not priests, not guards. Their faces were hidden, their hands ink-stained. They were the scribes of the ritual, not from the temples, but from the dark corners of forgotten places. Sedekir raised a hand. The torches dimmed. He began to speak, not in Egyptian, but in a tongue lost long before the first pyramid. His voice echoed strangely, as if the chamber itself was responding. The walls hummed, the altar pulsed, and the markings began to glow with a faint, dull light. The chamber, once cold, was now thick with warmth and pressure, like the inside of a forge. And far above, unnoticed, the blood moon rose. Tefari and the others arrived just beyond the final bend, hidden behind a crumbled portion of wall. From there, they could see the entrance to the chamber. 2 guards stood at attention, faces blank, expressions unreadable. Merit leaned in close and whispered, "If we get any nearer, we'll be seen." Tefari nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the flicker of red light coming from the cracks in the chamber walls. It wasn't firelight. It was something else, alive somehow, like it was breathing. "We need a diversion," he said quietly. Amunef reached into his satchel and pulled out a small clay jar filled with powdered incense used only in royal funerals. If we light this, it'll create thick smoke, enough to confuse them. Merritt gave a nervous glance. That'll also bring everyone running. Exactly, Tafari said. That's what we want. They lit the jar and rolled it down the hallway. Within seconds, a dark gray smoke began to curl up toward the ceiling. The guards coughed, turned toward the disturbance, and that's when the three of them slipped past the edge of the wall and into the shadows of the chamber entrance. Inside, the ritual had reached its peak. Sedekere was now shouting, arms raised. The altar glowed bright crimson. The walls pulsed harder. Dust fell from the ceiling. A low, vibrating hum shook the ground. The hooded scribes were chanting in unison, their hands raised over open scrolls glowing with invisible ink. Something was coming. Something ancient. Something terrible. Tafari moved quickly, silently, along the back wall. He spotted the base of the altar, two support beams, newly installed to hold the weight of the granite slab above. If they collapsed, the altar would crack, maybe even bring the ceiling down. He motioned to Amunef and Merritt. She handed him a small satchel of temple oil, highly flammable, meant for ceremonial flames. Amunef produced a wick. They worked fast, all three of them barely breathing. Then suddenly, a voice rang out. Tafari. Sedekere's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. Cold, steady, amused. All movement stopped. Tafari turned. The pharaoh stood tall above the altar, robes glowing with firelight, arms lowered now, hands open like a prophet. I wondered when you'd show yourself, he said. Tafari said nothing. I'll let your little rebellion grow, Sedekere went on. I wanted to see how far you'd go. I wanted you here tonight. You and your friends. A slow grin crept across the pharaoh's face. Because you're part of the offering. And with that, he clapped his hands once. The chamber doors slammed shut. The scribes turned, faces now visible in the light. They were not men Tafari recognized. Their eyes were completely black. Their skin was pale as bone, and their mouths moved in silence. The walls groaned. The altar pulsed again, and a deep, low growl rumbled from beneath the stone. Tafari grabbed the oil and hurled it forward. Amunef struck the wick and threw it. The explosion was small, but enough. The base of the altar caught fire, flames licking up the side, casting wild shadows across the chamber. Screams erupted. The scribes backed away, hissing like snakes. The glow on the walls flickered, and in that moment of chaos, the chamber trembled violently. Cracks split across the ceiling. Dust and stone rained down. The fire spread to the scrolls. The air filled with thick smoke and the bitter smell of burning ink. Sedekere shouted in rage, his voice no longer human. It echoed in two tones, one his own, the other something deeper, something not of this world. He stepped down from the altar, reaching toward the flames, and the very ground beneath him split open. From the crack, a black mist rose, twisting and coiling like a serpent. It moved toward the fire, and then recoiled, screeching. The flames weren't just fire now. They were something older, something sacred. The balance had prepared more than Tafari had known. Merritt grabbed Tafari's arm. We have to go now. But Tafari didn't move. He was staring at Sedekere, who was no longer smiling. The pharaoh stumbled, the black mist wrapping around his legs, climbing his body. He gasped, reached out, but no one came. The scribes had vanished. The mist thickened, pulling him toward the cracked floor. And in one final moment, he looked at Tafari, his face filled not with anger, but fear. Then he was gone, swallowed by the earth. The chamber groaned once more, and then collapsed. The last thing Tafari saw before the dust took everything was the altar crumbling into the smoke. Then silence, the kind that isn't peaceful, the kind that waits. Because in the deepest parts of the ruined chamber, not everything had been destroyed, and some things still wait to be found. For days after the collapse, the palace was silent. No announcements were made, no morning rituals, no public decrees about the fate of the pharaoh. Just silence, the kind of silence that weighed down on people's shoulders and followed them home. Those who lived near the temple ruins spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all. They said the earth had opened up and swallowed the temple whole, that the night of the blood moon had changed something in the land. The air felt thicker. Animals acted strange. Even the river had stopped rising, its waters still and glassy, as if it too was watching. Tafari emerged from the rubble covered in ash and bruises. He didn't remember how he got out. One moment he was reaching for the others, the next he was lying on the edge of the cliff, coughing dust. Merritt and Amunef had made it out too, but barely. Amunef had a deep gash on his arm and walked with a limp. Merritt's eyes were red from smoke and strain. They didn't speak much in the days that followed. What they had seen in the chamber, the black mist, the pharaoh's voice changing, the altar glowing from within, it stayed with them like a shadow. But something else lingered too. Despite everything, no one came to claim the throne. Egypt had always followed rules, even in death. When a pharaoh died, his burial was swift, his name praised, his successor named. But now, days passed, and no voice called out a new ruler. The royal court was still. The scribes' halls empty. The guards seemed unsure of who they served. In the absence of leadership, a quiet uncertainty spread through the capital. People kept to their homes. Temples stayed closed. Even the birds seemed to fly differently, circling over the ruins like they were waiting for something to return. Tafari knew the danger wasn't over. The ritual had been interrupted, not destroyed. And even though the chamber had fallen, the black mist, that thing, had been real. It had touched the world. Maybe just for a moment, but it had made contact. Something had stirred in the deep places of the earth. And now that connection couldn't simply be undone. In the days that followed, Tafari returned to the temple site at night. Not through the main entrance, but through the old delivery tunnels. Most were blocked by rock, but he found a narrow path, just wide enough to crawl through. He carried no torch, only a small oil lamp wrapped in cloth to soften the light. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. The walls were cracked and scorched. Symbols half-burned still glowed faintly beneath the soot. And the strange hum, soft, slow, like a heartbeat in the stone, it was still there. One night, near the lowest point of the tunnel, he found something buried beneath a slab of limestone. It was a scroll, singed around the edges but still readable. The script was old, older than anything from the temple libraries. He couldn't read all of it, but the parts he could made his stomach twist. It spoke of a time before the gods, a time before light and balance. It described a gate buried deep in the land, sealed by forgotten kings, guarded not by warriors but by silence. A warning carved in the margins read, "Asterisk, the gate is not a door. It is a mirror. What passes through becomes what it sees." Asterisk. Tafari didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough. Sedekar had not simply wanted to become immortal. He had wanted to step through that gate, whatever it was, and bring something back. Or, worse, bring something in. But why? Was it desperation? Madness? Or something else? Tafari remembered how Sedekar used to stand in court, never blinking, never smiling. How his words were always careful, like each sentence had been rehearsed 1,000 times. The older officials used to say he saw too much, that he watched everything, even dreams. At the time, it was just fear talking. But now, Tafari wasn't so sure. What if Sedekar had been influenced long before the ritual? What if the black mist hadn't appeared because of the ceremony, but had been guiding it all along? The thought unsettled him, because it meant Sedekar wasn't the beginning. He was the result. In the weeks after the collapse, strange things continued to happen. A priest in a small town along the Nile was found wandering alone, muttering about echoes in the sky. A farmer near Memphis claimed he saw a figure standing in his field every night, just watching, but disappearing at sunrise. Children in the capital had started drawing odd symbols in the dust, symbols no one had taught them. And always, the river ran strangely still. Amunef tried to make sense of it through the old scrolls. He spent every waking hour reading, comparing symbols, tracing roots of ancient myths. What he found was a scattered story buried across multiple dynasties. It told of a ruler whose name had been removed from all monuments, not because of failure, but because of something he brought into the world. A great darkness, one that nearly consumed the land before the priests intervened. They had sealed the truth, hidden it beneath temples, buried it under false tombs, and spread lies to protect the balance. The pharaoh's name was erased, and his legacy replaced with myths of honor. But the actual story, the real one, was hidden so deeply that only fragments remained. Merit, meanwhile, began traveling from town to town as a healer. Not because she was running, but because she wanted to listen. She asked about dreams, about strange behavior, about patterns no one else noticed. And what she found was chilling. People across Egypt were experiencing the same nightmares. Not every night, but often enough to feel more than coincidence. In the dreams, they stood before a black stone gate. They were always alone, and something on the other side was whispering. Each time, the voice would say the same phrase, asterisk, I am already here. Asterisk, Tafari, Amunef, and Merit didn't share these findings openly. Not yet. They didn't know who to trust. Many of the priests who remained had once served Sedekere. The palace guards answered to no one. And worse, some of the people who'd helped them during the rebellion had started acting different. Not openly, not violently, but distant, distracted, like something inside them had shifted. One of the former guards, a man named Nefer, came to Tafari late one night and spoke calmly about a vision he'd had. He said the pharaoh wasn't dead, that he was beneath the skin of the world now, that the gate hadn't closed. It had only blinked. Then Nefer walked into the river and never surfaced. The longer Tafari thought about it, the more he feared they hadn't stopped anything. They'd simply interrupted it, and the gate, whatever it was, wasn't finished. In fact, the scroll he'd found hinted that it wasn't even the only one. There were others, hidden across the land, dormant, waiting for someone else to open them. And even now, as the days grew stranger and the whispers returned, he realized something else, something that made the hairs on his arms rise. He had started to dream of the gate too. The first time Tafari dreamed of the gate, he woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, and certain he had spoken aloud during the night. The shadows in his chamber looked longer than they should have, stretching across the walls like they had lives of their own. The silence outside wasn't the usual nighttime calm, but heavy, pressing, as if something just beyond the window was waiting to be acknowledged. In the dream, the gate had not been a solid door. It looked like water standing upright, a surface so still and dark it reflected nothing. Behind it, he couldn't see shapes or light, only movement, shifting, slithering, like smoke under glass. And then, always just before he woke up, a voice, faint but cold, spoke through the dream. Asterisk, one gate falls. One gate stirs. Asterisk. Tafari began keeping a record of each dream. Not just his own, but ones told to him by others. At first, it was just scattered notes, times, words, symbols. But slowly, patterns began to emerge. Certain symbols appeared again and again, described by villagers who'd never met each other. Certain phrases repeated in different dialects. Even the description of the gate, the watery surface, the shadowy movements behind it, remained consistent. He shared his findings with Amunef, who had turned one of the abandoned palace rooms into a study. Parchments lined the walls. Old maps stretched across tables, pinned with stones and pieces of string. Amunef's once neat handwriting had grown hurried and rough, a sign of how deep he'd gone into the research. He didn't sleep much anymore either. What if the gates aren't just places? Amunef said one evening, staring into a flickering oil lamp. What are more ideas? Or points of weakness? Cracks in the surface of what we know as the world. And Sedekere didn't create one. He just found one. Or worse, was led to it. Tafari didn't reply, but the idea settled deep in his thoughts. It made sense in a terrifying way. For all of Sedekere's ambition, he'd always seemed like a man chasing something. Like he wasn't guiding the ritual, but following instructions. And if that was true, then the source of those instructions was still out there. Merit's journeys through the countryside added more weight to the growing fear. People she spoke with told her of sudden deaths. Men found staring at nothing, their eyes wide open, their mouths shaped in a final whisper. They spoke of livestock refusing to cross certain spots in the fields, of mirrors cracking for no reason, of wells that ran dry, then filled overnight with water that smelled like iron. And then came the children. Dozens of them across small villages had begun drawing the same symbol in the dirt. A circle with a thin line down the center, surrounded by jagged marks like broken rays. When asked what it meant, some shrugged. Others said it was a door. One girl, no more than 7, simply said, "It watches me." Merritt brought one of the drawings to Amunef. He froze when he saw it. "This isn't just a symbol," he whispered. "It's a warning. It's ancient, older than our language. It means never return." Tafari began to feel the pressure building, not just from the dreams, but from the strange way people behaved around him. He started seeing familiar faces turn away when he approached. Former allies of the balance who once stood proudly beside him now offered vague smiles and distant eyes. It was subtle at first, but undeniable. The black mist had not just stirred beneath the temple. It had spread. But how? And more importantly, why? It was Amunef who uncovered the next piece of the mystery. While translating a series of fragmented hymns from an abandoned tomb near Saqqara, he discovered a passage that sent chills through his hands. It spoke of a time of awakening, when the world would unpeel its sky, and the watchers beneath would be remembered. The text mentioned 5 gates, 5 weaknesses, 5 points of invitation. Only one had been touched, which meant 4 remained. They didn't know where the others were. Not yet, but one thing was now clear. The ritual had opened more than just a door. It had started a chain, and something was following it. Tafari didn't tell anyone about the second dream right away. This one was different. He wasn't standing before the gate anymore. He was behind it, or maybe within it. Everything was black, but not empty. There was texture, movement, and he wasn't alone. Something was moving around him, slowly, deliberately. He couldn't see it, but he felt it. Cold fingers brushing against his back. A soft voice whispering not words, but intent. Not to harm him, but to understand him. When he woke up, he found a small cut on his hand. Not deep, not even painful, just there, and he had no memory of receiving it. That day, he didn't go to the study. He didn't speak to Merritt or Amunef. He walked the river's edge, trying to clear his thoughts. But even the river had changed. The reflection of the sky on its surface rippled where there was no wind. And when he looked too long into the water, he thought he saw his own reflection blink at a different time than he did. Back at the capital, rumors were growing. People whispered of the return of the old breath. Some claimed to have seen shadows moving through sealed tombs. Others said they'd heard drums deep underground, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the soil. The guards that remained loyal to the palace had grown nervous, staying close to the inner quarters and rarely speaking. No one dared declare a new pharaoh, and the statues of Sedeker, some of which had been shattered after his fall, began to appear whole again. Not restored by craftsmen, just reappearing, in the same places, as if they had never been broken. Some swore they changed positions during the night. Others claimed they were different, just slightly. The eyes deeper, the mouth more curved. Watching, Tafari started to understand that this was no longer about one cruel pharaoh. This was about something older, something that had used Sedeker to test the boundary between worlds. And now, with that test complete, it was watching to see what would happen next. He met with Amunef and Merritt that night beneath the remains of the old temple. There was no plan yet, no solution, just questions, and the creeping understanding that time was slipping through their hands. "I think we were wrong," Merritt said softly. "We thought we stopped him. But what if that was the point? What if the ritual failing was meant to scatter the gate's energy? To send it across the land?" Amunef looked tired. "Then the dreamers aren't just dreamers," he said. "They're keys." Tafari looked between them, heart pounding. Then what happens when the next gate opens? None of them had an answer. But far away, in a forgotten valley where no one lived anymore, where the wind hadn't stirred in decades, a stone monolith began to hum. And beneath it, sealed in soil older than history, something blinked for the first time in thousands of years. That night, a deep chill swept across the valley where the monolith stood. No stars pierced the sky above it, only a thick, velvet blackness that swallowed light whole. The stone itself had been buried for centuries, perhaps longer, but now it sat half-revealed, cracked from the top like a lid ready to open. Strange carvings pulsed faintly along its surface, as if lit from within by something alive. The ground around it was dead. No grass, no insects, no sign that anything had ever dared linger near it for long. And yet the silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of something holding its breath. In the capital, Tafari had stopped sleeping. Each time he closed his eyes, he was pulled deeper into the dreams. There were no longer visions of the gate alone. Now he saw places he'd never been. Deserts with red sand that whispered like voices when the wind blew. Cities carved into stone mountains, empty and crumbling, but filled with shadows that walked. And always the Watchers, tall, faceless forms just at the edge of his sight, standing still, heads tilted as if trying to remember who they had once been. In one dream, he found himself in a hallway lit by torches that burned blue. The walls were covered in symbols he didn't understand, but his hand reached out and traced them like he had written them himself. And as he walked further, the hallway narrowed, the ceiling dipped, and a voice echoed through the stone, not with words, but with knowing. It pressed against his thoughts, searching him, sifting through memories. He woke with blood on his pillow, his nose having bled during the night. But more disturbing than that was the faint, black mark on his arm, circular, with a thin vertical line through it. The symbol of the gate. Merit and Amunef had begun documenting all signs of similar markings. They traveled in secret, using coded messages to communicate. More dreamers had been found. Some had only seen flickers, strange lands, odd sounds, but others had seen far more. One farmer near Abydos claimed he was no longer dreaming in his own body. When I close my eyes, he told Merit, I become someone else. I look through their eyes. I walk through rooms I don't know, but feel familiar. And they feel me too. I can tell. They know I'm watching them. He was found 2 days later, sitting motionless beside his field, eyes wide open, the same black mark scorched into the earth beside him. Amunef grew more convinced they were running out of time. This isn't just ancient magic, he said during one of their secret meetings. It's memory, the kind that exists beneath language. Whatever these Watchers are, whatever force is behind the gates, it remembers. It's waking up, not because we called it, but because we made enough noise for it to hear us. Tafari didn't argue. He'd started to feel it too, not just in dreams, but in waking hours. A sense of being watched, a pressure in his chest that came and went, especially near water or mirrors. He found himself drawn to reflections, staring longer than he meant to, sometimes catching glimpses that didn't feel quite like his own. Once he swore he saw someone standing behind him in a basin of water, though no one was there when he turned. Merit, ever observant, began noticing changes in the people around them. Children grew unusually quiet. They stared at adults with unreadable expressions. Elders started whispering old prayers no one had taught them. The village dogs howled at dusk, then fell silent as if something had answered them. And birds, so many birds, had begun to circle the skies above the ruins of Sedeker's temple, though they never landed. The temple ruins themselves had changed. Though still broken and scorched, small carvings had begun appearing in the stone, not made by hand, but etched from within, as if the rock itself was remembering. The marks matched the symbols seen in dreams, in villages, on arms. And no matter how many times they were scratched away or buried under dirt, they always returned. Tafari spent hours at the ruins, tracing the lines with his fingers. He began to feel a connection, a pull, not of understanding, but of belonging. And that terrified him more than anything. He'd fought so hard to stop Sedeker, to break the chain of cruelty, to protect the people. But now he feared something inside him had changed, as if by opposing the gate, he had drawn its gaze onto himself. One night, he found himself standing before the cliff where the chamber had collapsed. The rocks were still jagged, the dust long settled. But the air felt wrong. Heavy, still. And then he heard it. A sound, not a voice. Not exactly, but a low, rhythmic pulse deep in the earth. Like breathing. And it wasn't alone. Tafari turned and saw Merit standing behind him, her eyes wide, lips parted in disbelief. She had heard it too. Amunef emerged from the path moments later, face pale. None of them spoke. They stood together in silence, listening to the impossible sound. Then, from within the ruins, a single stone shifted. It didn't roll. It didn't fall. It moved, as if pushed from beneath. The three stepped back slowly. Merit reached for the small jar of protective herbs she now carried everywhere. Amunef whispered a prayer. Tafari said nothing. He was staring at the stone, heart thundering, because carved into the underside, exposed by the shift, was a symbol they had never seen before. It was not the gate. It was a map, crude and ancient, scratched into the stone by something that didn't use hands the way humans did. A rough outline of land, rivers, stars, and 5 points marked along a single crooked line, like steps or openings. Tafari knelt, eyes scanning the shapes. "These are the gates," he whispered. "This is where they are." Merit leaned in, her breath catching. "But these stars, this isn't our sky. These constellations, they don't exist anymore." Amunef looked up at the horizon, the wind stirring his robes. "Then maybe we're not dealing with something from our time at all." Tafari stood slowly, heart pounding. "We've been looking backward," he said, "at ancient history, at old gods, old rituals. But this thing, these gates, they're not just part of the past. They're outside of it. They're older than time. And now they're bleeding into ours." No one responded, because somewhere far in the distance, beyond the cliffs, a low rumble began to rise. Not thunder, not wind, but drums, pulsing from the earth itself, calling, responding, and the watchers, wherever they waited, had started to listen again. That night, after the sound of the earth's drums faded back into silence, Tafari didn't return home. He wandered the outer edge of the valley, away from the broken temple and the exposed map, trying to gather his thoughts. Every step he took seemed to echo too loudly, and every gust of wind carried a hum just below hearing. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Something ancient had awakened, and its reach was no longer limited to forgotten chambers or broken rituals. It was bleeding into everything, dreams, minds, even the land itself. Back at the capital, tension tightened like a rope with every passing day. Without a pharaoh, a strange power vacuum held the city in quiet chaos. Council members met behind closed doors, arguing over who should rule next. Some wanted to return to old traditions, others called for new voices, and a few whispered about Tafari himself. But none dared speak publicly. They were too afraid, not of rebellion or war, but of something they didn't understand. They too had started dreaming. Some wept openly in the halls. Others refused to sleep at all. And in their silence, the black-robed priests who had once served Sedekere began appearing again, quietly, without fanfare, taking positions near the temples and the gates of the city. They said nothing, asked nothing, just watched. Merit saw the change first. One afternoon, while tending to an injured child near the outer market, she noticed two of the black-robed priests standing at the far end of the street. Not speaking, not moving, just standing in perfect stillness, eyes fixed on her. The moment she turned away, they vanished. It happened again in the next village, and again near the river's edge. It wasn't until the fifth sighting that she realized something chilling. Each time she saw them, she experienced a nosebleed the next morning, the same kind that Tafari had started getting. And the dreams grew stronger afterward. Amunef, buried in his scrolls and symbols, was growing frantic. He had started mapping more than just dreams. He was tracking weather changes, magnetic shifts in the stones, even patterns in animal behavior. And all of it pointed to one truth. The gates were not random. They were aligning with something. A cycle, a pattern written into the stars themselves. The last time this happened, he muttered late one night, there were no scribes to write it down. That's why the stories are broken. That's why the myths contradict each other. because the truth was never meant to be remembered. Tafari leaned over the old maps. And if we remember it now? Amunef didn't answer. He just looked up, eyes rimmed red, and said, then we won't be allowed to forget it again. Elsewhere, in the dry northern hills, another story was beginning. A caravan of traders had gone missing. Not unusual, given the harsh routes. But when searchers finally found their camp, the scene was wrong. The camels were untouched. The wagons still full of supplies. But every man and woman was gone. No sign of a struggle. Only the same strange markings burned into the ground near the center of the tents. The desert guide spoke of shadows that walked at noon, of whispers in the dust that didn't stop when the wind did. And far beyond the dunes, a shepherd claimed to have seen lights, deep green and flickering, rising from the rocks before fading into the sky. Back in the capital, whispers spread of a city near the western cliffs where no one slept anymore. Merchants who passed through said the people there just stared at the horizon, silent, unmoving, as if listening to something none of them could hear. A week later, a trader returned from that town and walked straight into the royal archive, laying a scroll on the table before collapsing. The scroll bore the same map Tafari had seen under the stone, but this one was older, painted on aged animal skin, its edges crumbling to dust. Amunef examined it and found a sixth mark, not part of the 5 gates, a separate place, a circle at the center of the other lines. The heart, he whispered. It's not a gate. It's the source. They didn't know where it was yet, but they knew someone or something was trying to draw attention away from it. All eyes were being directed to the gates, but the true danger might lie in what connected them. Merritt began noticing changes in her own reflection. Not physical ones, but small things, delays in movement, a brief flicker where her mouth moved, but her voice didn't. Once, while washing her face in a stream, she saw her reflection smile at her, even though she hadn't moved a muscle. She didn't tell Tafari, at least not right away. Tafari had grown quieter in recent days, pulled further into himself. His dreams were now filled not with fear, but questions. He would walk through endless halls, through fields of dead stone, through cities that hummed without people. And always, something was waiting ahead, just around the corner, just beyond the door. It never rushed him, never chased him, just waited. One night, in the dream, he finally saw it, a shape in the distance. Tall, thin. Its face was smooth, no features, just a faint curve where eyes might be. It stood at the edge of a cliff, arms raised, and when it turned to him, he felt his heart stop. Not from fear, from recognition. He didn't tell anyone what he saw, not even when he woke with a new mark on his chest. A smaller circle, this time filled with tiny, intricate symbols he couldn't read. Amunef examined it in silence, his face pale. You've been marked by the source, he said. Merritt backed away slightly. What does that mean? It means, Amunef whispered, he's not just seeing the gates anymore. He's part of them. That night, Tafari stood on the temple cliff once more. The wind was sharp. The stars above had shifted slightly again. He looked out over the ruins, the dark horizon beyond, and whispered, What do you want from me? The silence answered, not with words, but with understanding. The gates were opening. The watchers were remembering, and the source had chosen him. Tafari didn't sleep at all after that night on the cliff. He sat in the dark, legs folded beneath him, staring at the horizon until the first light of dawn painted the sands with pale gold. The dreams hadn't just followed him anymore. They had found him. Whatever presence lingered behind the gates had seen into him, reached past his defenses, and left its mark, not just on his skin, but in his mind. He kept hearing a single thought repeating over and over, like a distant whisper pressed against his skull. Asterisk, you are the echo. You are the return. Asterisk. The words didn't make full sense yet, but they carried weight. A feeling, like something ancient was being recalled through him. Not possession, more like purpose. As if whatever force had guided Sedekere was now watching Tafari with curious eyes, waiting to see what he'd do. When he returned to the capital later that morning, he found the air had shifted again. The streets were quieter than before. People moved with deliberate slowness. Faces turned toward shadows. Conversations stopped when he passed. He wasn't sure if it was fear or recognition. He met Amunef and Merit in the old study where they'd been hiding their scrolls and maps. The moment he stepped into the room, Merit stood up. "You've changed," she said gently, her eyes scanning his face. Tafari didn't deny it. "I feel it too." Amunef didn't speak. He just stared at the mark on Tafari's chest, now darkened slightly, the edges of the symbol more defined. Around it, smaller symbols had begun to emerge, almost like veins extending outward. "I've seen this before," Amunef said finally. "Not exactly, but something close. In a temple ruined deep beneath the Valley of the Kings. One of the sealed chambers. It had carvings on the wall of a man marked just like this. The text called him Nedjeretep, not a god, but a bridge." Merit's brow furrowed. A bridge to what? Amunef turned one of the maps around and pointed to the center circle, the one they believed to be the source. "To whatever is at the heart of all this. That mark, it doesn't just connect you to the gates. It may be leading you to the source, whether you want it or not." Tafari felt the weight of that land heavy on his shoulders. All his life, he had wanted to serve the people, protect them from tyrants like Sedekere. But now he was part of something so much larger, something outside human rule, outside even human understanding. He didn't know whether he was chosen or trapped. The three of them spent the next 2 days piecing together what they could. They mapped the dreams of others, charted patterns in the weather, and translated the oldest fragments they had. One message kept repeating across them all, buried in metaphors and scattered lines. Asterisk, when 5 awaken, the sky will break. When the heart opens, the world will bend. Asterisk, they still didn't know where the 5th gate was, or if it had already been disturbed. But one thing was certain, something had already begun, and the signs were no longer subtle. Reports flooded in from remote villages. Dead wells suddenly refilling overnight, but with black water that shimmered unnaturally in sunlight. Children walking into the desert and returning days later, unharmed but silent, their eyes glazed over like they'd seen something too large to understand. Whole flocks of birds circling old monuments in perfect spirals for hours. And most disturbing of all, people who should have died by illness, injury, or even age, suddenly waking, eyes wide, whispering unknown names in forgotten languages. Even Amunef, the ever-rational scribe, began to believe they were no longer dealing with mere prophecy. "This isn't about foretelling," he said. "This is memory, something older than time itself, trying to remember through us." Merit, too, had changed. She kept a pouch of herbs on her at all times now, not just for healing, but to ward off whatever it was that lingered in places where time felt too still. She had started sleeping during the day to avoid the dreams. But even that didn't help much anymore. One afternoon, she woke with a whisper still ringing in her ears. Asterisk, we are waiting in the place where stars forget to burn. Asterisk, that same day, an earthquake struck a village near the Red Sea. Nothing major, no destruction, no casualties, but something had cracked open in the cliffs nearby. Locals said they heard music echoing from the fault line. Not flutes or drums, but a low, constant humming, like wind through stone, but not made by the wind. Tafari left the capital that evening. He told no one where he was going. He just followed the pull. The land guided him, not with signs, but with silence. Whenever he started heading the wrong direction, the air would grow heavy or animals would retreat from his path. When he turned back the right way, the wind would return, cool and steady. He stopped needing maps. His body began to know the way. Every mile brought new memories, visions he hadn't lived, faces he didn't recognize. Not terrifying, but foreign. Familiar in the way a forgotten childhood memory sometimes feels. He reached the edge of the valley 4 nights later. It didn't look like anything special at first. Just another hollow of red rock and windswept sand. But something was buried there. He could feel it. The center of the source. A heart beneath the earth. He waited until nightfall. Then he knelt on the ground, pressed his palm against the sand, and closed his eyes. The heartbeat came slowly at first, distant, uncertain, but then it grew. Stronger, louder, not sound, but vibration. A rhythm that pulsed up through his hand, into his chest, into the mark over his heart. His breath caught. The world around him faded. All sound disappeared. And in the darkness behind his closed eyes, he saw it. The Real Gate. Not a doorway, but a wound in space. A tear stitched with symbols that moved like living ink. Behind it, not a place but a presence. Watching him. Waiting. You are the bridge, it said. Asterisk, we have always known you. Asterisk. Tafari gasped and opened his eyes. He was alone in the valley. But the sand beneath him had changed. It wasn't sand anymore. It was stone, black and polished, etched with symbols that shimmered like fire. And the stars above him? They were in a pattern he'd never seen before. But he knew exactly what it meant. Tafari didn't move for a long time. He just sat there, knees in the dust, staring at the strange polished stone beneath him, trying to make sense of the symbols now glowing faintly under his palms. They weren't written in any known script. They felt alive, moving, shifting, like threads of light that pulsed with each breath he took. It was as if the land itself had reshaped beneath him the moment he touched the heart of it all. The wind had stopped completely. The silence wasn't just empty, it was expectant. He finally stood, slowly, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. The stars above shimmered unnaturally, flickering in a way he'd never seen before. He had grown used to the strange signs, the dreams, the whispers in the dark. But this was different. This was real. The air around him vibrated faintly, like the hum of something massive stirring beneath the surface. The pull that had brought him here hadn't left. It was stronger now, deeper. Not painful, but persistent. A thrum behind his ribs, sinking with a strange pulse beneath the earth. As he looked around, he realized the valley wasn't as empty as it had seemed at first. Along the edges of the stone floor, small stone figures had emerged. Pillars no taller than a man, each etched with deep, ancient grooves. They looked like guardians, or markers. Watching, waiting. Back in the capital, Merritt felt it too. She had been in the temple's shadowed corner, sorting supplies and reviewing dream accounts from distant villages, when the oil lamp beside her flickered violently. The wall shook once, just once, and then grew cold. All the birds in the trees outside took flight at once, circling overhead, screeching into the sky. A child nearby burst into tears without knowing why. And Merritt fell to her knees, clutching her head, as a voice echoed through her mind, not in words, but in emotion. An overwhelming presence. Not angry, not kind, simply aware. She stood and ran, straight to Amunef, who was deep in the scrolls, hunched over maps that now seemed to twist with meanings they hadn't shown before. He had seen the same stars Tafari saw. He had felt the same shift in the earth. It's happening, he whispered as she burst in. The alignment has begun. Merritt's voice trembled. He's there, isn't he? Wherever it is. He's standing on the heart. Amunef nodded slowly. And the source it knows. As they tried to gather supplies, to leave, to reach him somehow, they both noticed something else. The people were no longer afraid. They were calm. Too calm. The streets that had been tense and cautious were now filled with people standing still, staring toward the west, toward the valley. No one moved. No one spoke. Their eyes were glazed, their mouths slightly open. It was like they were listening to something no one else could hear. And in the center of the palace courtyard, the shattered statue of Sedekir stood whole once more. Not dusty or broken, but as if it had never fallen. As if the time between its destruction and its return had simply folded inward. A crack of thunder echoed, though no storm brewed above. The air felt thicker now, like the space between moments was stretching. Tafari stepped forward inside the valley, each footstep sending small pulses of light across the black stone. The map at the center of it had rearranged itself. 5 lines, 5 points, and then the 6th. Not a destination, but a link. The bridge, just like the whispers had said. Around him, the air started to ripple. Not like heat, but like breath. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, the dream returned while he was still awake. He was standing inside the gate again, but this time it was open. Not fully, but enough to see the other side. He didn't see death. He didn't see monsters. What he saw was something far worse. Familiarity. The land on the other side looked like Egypt. But not as Egypt. It was different. The stars were twisted versions of their own, the pyramids taller, darker, and pulsing with red light. Figures moved in the distance, shaped like people, but wrong in ways his mind couldn't fully grasp. And in the center of it all, something massive loomed, draped in smoke and gold, its face hidden behind a shifting mask of mirrored light. It turned to him slowly, not in surprise, but in recognition. "You were the first," it said, though no lips moved. Asterisk, "You are the last." Asterisk. He tried to speak, but his voice didn't work. Instead, he reached for the connection between them, and the gate pulsed violently. Behind him, in the waking world, the sky had begun to turn. A deep blue had taken over, darker than night, and the sun dimmed though it hadn't set. Shadows stretched long across the valley, bending and twisting. The stone beneath his feet began to fracture, not crumble, but open. From deep within, a sound emerged. Not like thunder or wind, but a voice. A chorus of voices, layered over one another, ancient and vast. They spoke not to his ears, but into his bones. The watchers were coming. In the capital, people began to move again, but not as themselves. Eyes blank, expressions empty, they turned toward the gates of the city and began to walk westward. Slowly, steadily, as if drawn, as if summoned. Merit and Amunef stood on the temple balcony, watching in horror. "We're losing them," Merit whispered. "No," Amunef said, gripping the railing, eyes wide. "They're being called." "By what?" He looked toward the western horizon, where a faint, pulsing glow now lit the sky. "Not what," he said. Asterisk, "Who starred it?" And far in the valley, at the very edge of the gate, Tafari took a breath and stepped forward. Just one step. The stone cracked open beneath him, and light, deep, otherworldly light, shot upward in a column, piercing the heavens. The wind howled, and the stars above flickered in and out like dying embers. And as the ground beneath him gave way, Tafari felt the presence move closer. Not to hurt, not to conquer, but to enter, and the gate finally began to open. The sky rippled like fabric caught in a slow, impossible wind. From the far reaches of the capital to the smallest villages at the edge of the desert, everyone could feel it, like a breath being drawn across the land. Crops bent without wind, doors creaked open with no hand to push them, and mirrors cracked gently down the center as if releasing something long trapped inside. The gate was opening, not in a rush, not with fury, but with certainty. In the valley, Tafari stood at the center of a storm made of stillness. The light rising from a stone beneath him wasn't bright in the usual sense. It didn't shine, it revealed. For a few moments, he could see the true shape of the world as it had been before time was written down. The lines between now and before blurred. He saw shadows walking through deserts that hadn't formed yet, cities made of obsidian and light, gods with no names kneeling before something even older. And in the very heart of it all, he saw the gate. Not a structure, not even a tear, but a convergence. A knot of memory, time, and will. Behind it, the presence loomed. It didn't threaten. It didn't demand. It waited. Merit and Amunef had traveled as far west as the river would take them before continuing on foot. The stars had changed above them, not in position, but in color. They shimmered with a dull reddish hue now, and in certain parts of the sky, there were simply no stars at all. Blank spaces, like forgotten names. The journey was harder than expected, not because of terrain, but because of the silence. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even their own voices seemed to fall flat, like sound didn't want to travel anymore. And in the distance, they saw others walking too, villagers, merchants, even soldiers, moving toward the same direction. All silent, all drawn west, toward the light that now rose faintly above the horizon like a ghostly beacon. Tafari didn't hear them coming, but he felt it when they arrived. He turned slowly as Merit and Amunef stepped into the valley's edge, both breathing hard, covered in dust, eyes wide with disbelief. Around them, The stone pillars hummed gently, casting faint pulses of that same revealing light. The air shimmered above the cracked earth, and the mark on Tafari's chest glowed faintly beneath his robes. "What is this place?" Merritt asked, voice shaking. Tafari didn't answer at first. He didn't need to. They could feel it too. This wasn't a tomb or a temple. It was a wound, a scar left by something older than all their gods, something that had never truly healed. "This is the heart," Amunef whispered, stepping closer. "The place before places. It's where the Watchers first looked and were seen." The three of them stood there, suspended in silence, while the world continued to change around them. Back in the capital, the statue of Sedekere cracked again, but this time from within. A thin web of black lines spread across its surface like veins. The people continued their slow march westward, eyes empty but calm. And behind them, the shadows deepened. Merritt knelt at the edge of the glowing stone and placed her palm against it. For a moment, her breath caught in her throat. She saw images, children drawing circles in the sand, elders chanting forgotten names, water turning to glass, birds flying backward through burning skies. But she also saw Tafari, as a boy, alone, standing in the same valley, long before he was ever born. She pulled her hand back, trembling. "This has all happened before," she whispered. "And it's happening again." Amunef looked at Tafari. "It's you. You're the bridge. They've marked you because you can carry memory. Across time, across worlds." "But why?" Tafari asked. "What do they want from me?" Merritt looked up at him, voice soft but steady. "Not to destroy, not to rule, to return. They were banished, forgotten, and now they're using you to come back." The light pulsed once more beneath their feet, and this time the stone groaned. From deep beneath, a shape began to rise. Not fast, not sudden, just inevitable. A platform, smooth and ancient, pushed upward with a grinding moan, dust sliding from its sides. Etched into its surface were 5 symbols, each one matching a gate they had seen across Egypt. But now there was a 6th, and that symbol wasn't carved. It was alive, a shifting pattern of light and shadow, always moving, impossible to focus on. Tafari stepped forward. "This is the key." Merritt reached out to stop him. "What happens if you touch it?" Tafari didn't look at her. I stopped being just me." Amunef closed his eyes. "And become what?" Tafari placed both hands on the 6th symbol. The moment his skin made contact, the valley shuddered. All across the land, mirrors shattered in unison. The sky flashed once, casting the landscape in strange hues. Villagers collapsed, not dead, but dreaming. Their eyes rolled back, their mouths moving silently. Animals wailed, rivers slowed, even the stars blinked. And then, a sound like thunder rolled up from beneath the earth. But not thunder. Laughter. Not cruel, not joyful. Something in between. Recognition. The presence behind the gate had seen its bridge open. It had waited so long, and now it was ready to cross. Tafari staggered back, his eyes wide and glowing faintly. For a moment, he wasn't fully here. His voice echoed, layered over itself in strange tones. "I remember now." "What?" Merritt asked, stepping forward, gripping his arm. "I remember what came before," Tafari said, his voice low. "What we were before." Amunef looked shaken. "You mean?" Tafari nodded. "We banished them. Long ago. Not with violence. With forgetting. We erased their names. We buried their symbols. And now, they've come back through us, because we remembered." The light intensified. All 6 symbols flared in unison. The gate began to open fully. Not in one place. Not in one time. Everywhere. All at once. And the Watchers stepped. Tafari's body trembled, but he didn't fall. His feet stayed rooted to the glowing stone, though the earth beneath seemed to pulse with energy that wanted to tear him apart and rebuild him all at once. The symbols surrounding him pulsed in waves, each flicker sending another ripple through the valley, reaching beyond the mountains, the rivers, and the minds of everyone tuned to the rhythm of this ancient awakening. The gate wasn't just opening. It was remembering, and with every moment, it remembered more. All around them, the world had begun to thin. The air had grown heavier, as if saturated with too many layers of time. Colors warped at the edges of vision. Rocks shimmered like mirages. The lines between dreams and waking life had dissolved so completely that even Merit began to forget where she was. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat and saw a burning sky. She opened them again and saw the same fire reflected into Tafari's eyes. "Look," Amunef whispered. Along the ridge of the valley, figures were forming. Not flesh and blood. Not yet. They were shapes, tall and impossibly thin, their outlines shifting like smoke trapped inside glass. They didn't move like people. They drifted, paused, tilted their heads in unison, watching, waiting. These were the watchers, the forgotten ones, the remembered ones, the ones who had waited in the cracks of time, behind memory and myth, just out of reach. Merit stepped forward, her heart thudding hard against her chest. "They're not attacking," she said. "They don't need to," Tafari replied quietly. "They don't want war. They want entry. They want to be known again." The mark on his chest now glowed steadily. It no longer felt like a curse. It felt like a signal, like a key. He realized that every vision, every dream, every strange echo through time had been preparing him for this moment. Not to fight, but to choose. All across Egypt, the signs intensified. Farmers dropped their tools and wandered into the sands, whispering old songs they didn't know they remembered. Children pointed at the sky and spoke names not recorded in any scroll. The desert cracked open in places, revealing ancient stairways, sealed doors, and symbols that pulsed with the same ghostly glow seen in the valley. Every gate marked on the map had begun to stir. The watchers were no longer just shadows. In the capital, the black-robed priests stood in a circle around the palace. Their faces were still veiled, but their hands glowed faintly at the fingertips. In perfect silence, they lifted their arms to the sky, forming a single, unified gesture that mirrored the sixth symbol on the map. It was a summons, a surrender, a recognition, a long-forgotten ritual. Above them, the sky cracked, not visibly, but with a sound that shattered thought. A distant ringing, like a bell struck in a hollow world, echoed across the land. Everyone felt it in their bones. It wasn't sound anymore. It was a call. In the valley, the watchers moved, not toward them, but around them, circling the stone field. Each step, though silent, felt heavy with meaning. They weren't approaching like invaders. They were arriving like a memory slipping back into place. A reunion, a reckoning. Tafari dropped to one knee, breathing hard. The presence in his mind was no longer just a whisper. It had form now, not language but awareness. It offered no comfort, no threat, only truth. He wasn't becoming something else. He was becoming who he had always been, the last of the bridge keepers, descendants of the first watchers who had once closed the gates to protect the world. And now, that role had returned to him. Amunef clutched one of the old scrolls in his hand, muttering to himself, trying to recite words that no longer held power. "We can't stop it," he finally said. "The gates aren't just open. They're the world now. We just never saw them before. What do they want from us?" Merit asked, voice thin with fear. Tafari looked at her, sweat on his brow, the light behind his eyes flickering like fire. To be known, to return, to belong again. A sound filled the valley, then, not human, not wind. A deep hum, vibrating the very air, like a drumbeat from another world. The stone underfoot cracked again, and the final line of the sixth symbol burned brighter than the others. The watchers all turned at once, toward Tafari. Every figure stood still. Every breath in the valley stopped. And Tafari rose. He didn't understand what he was doing, but his body moved with a purpose not his own. His arms stretched outward, palms open to the sky. The symbol on his chest spread outward, glowing through his robes like sunlight through cloth. The humming grew louder. The air grew colder. The gate was no longer waiting. It was asking, and every soul across the land felt the question pressed into their minds. "Do you remember us?" Tafari's voice broke the silence. But it wasn't just his. It was layered, echoed, ancient, and new all at once. "I do." And at that moment, The sky opened. The sky didn't tear apart the way Teferi feared. It unfolded, like silk slipping free from an invisible seam, revealing not fire, not storm, but something worse. A mirror, a reflection of the world they stood in, hovering above them, twisted just enough to make the air turn cold. The pyramids in that sky were inverted. The stars spun in reverse. The rivers flowed uphill. And the watchers, they were everywhere. Not just circling the valley now. They filled the mirrored world above, standing shoulder to shoulder, looking down through the veil like they were staring into a pool. Teferi's heart pounded. The connection between him and the presence on the other side pulsed brighter than ever, almost blinding. But then the light stuttered. A cold ripple shot down his spine. Something had changed. The watchers above were no longer calm. Their postures shifted, heads tilted, mouths that hadn't existed a moment ago opened into wide, silent howls. The harmony between worlds had faltered. Something was wrong. Behind him, Merritt gasped. "Something else is coming," she whispered, and it was a second force, older than the watchers, buried beneath the gate, deeper than even the presence that had awakened him. The stone beneath their feet began to vibrate again, but not from the gate's rhythm. This was different, uneven, chaotic, a second pulse, beating against the first. It felt like an argument between the bones of the earth, and then the glow in the sixth symbol flickered. A crack formed across the black stone, running straight through the center of the symbol. Amunef dropped the scroll he was holding. No, this wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered. "There is only one gate, one force. That's what the legends say. That's what they all say." Teferi backed away, his hands burning with energy. They were wrong. Merritt looked to the mirrored sky. "Then what is that?" They turned toward the horizon, and there, walking across the red sands, came a figure. Alone, human in shape, cloaked in dark linen that didn't touch the ground. As it moved, the watchers parted, drawing back as if in fear. Even the ones in the mirrored sky seemed to retreat slightly, flickering at the edges. The figure stepped into the valley without hesitation. Its face was hidden beneath a worn gold mask, weathered, cracked, but strangely familiar. Teferi's heart froze. He knew that face. He had seen it in temples, in nightmares, on the shattered walls of Sedekir's old palace. It was the true face of Sedekir. Amunef fell to his knees. "Impossible. He's dead. You killed him." But the figure didn't stop. And when it finally stood before them, the truth settled like ash. It wasn't Sedekir exactly. It was what had used him. A remnant. An echo of the first betrayal. The one who had turned against the watchers before the gates were sealed. And now it had found its way back. Teferi felt the gate behind him recoil, the watchers pulling away. Even they were not prepared for this. They had waited to return, yes, but they had not expected to find their ancient enemy waiting inside the world they had once been cast out of. The masked figure raised a hand, and the mirrored sky shattered, not with sound, but with silence so complete it felt like it sucked the breath from the earth. The broken pieces of the false sky fell in slow spirals, flickering like glass in water, vanishing before touching the ground. And behind that shattered mirror, another world, but not one anyone recognized. Not Egypt, not a reflection. Something broken, rotting temples, skies the color of old blood, sands that whispered in tongues older than human language. And across that horizon were thousands of shapes, watchers twisted into something crueler, something hungry. These weren't the ones who had waited. These were the ones who had taken. And now, they were coming. Teferi staggered backward. "It wasn't just a gate," he said. "It was a prison, and I've broken it." The masked figure nodded once. And then, for the first time, it spoke. Not in words, in memories. Teferi saw it. Flashes of time before kings, before pyramids. When humans lived in fear of the sky, and the watchers walked openly. A war forgotten by time. A betrayal. One of their own siding with the other side. Tearing open a second gate. A deeper gate. One that couldn't be closed. Only hidden. That's what Sedekir had been trying to do. Not to rule. Not to bring back the watchers. To release their enemy. The watchers had come through the first gate, but the second gate, the deeper one, had remained sealed. Until now. Merritt grabbed Tafari's hand. What do we do? He looked into the sky, heart beating like a drum. We end what they started. But before he could speak again, the valley trembled once more. The second gate was opening, and what waited on the other side was not looking for peace. The air in the valley turned sharp and electric, like the sky itself was pulling in a breath it didn't know how to hold. Tafari could feel it in his teeth, in his bones, in the steady tremble of the stones beneath him. The first gate had opened gently, like a memory being recalled. But the second gate, the deeper one, it was ripping itself into the world with no care, no grace. It was a wound tearing wider every second. The masked figure, Sedekare's echo, lifted its hand again, and this time the ground split open in a jagged line straight through the heart of the valley. Light poured upward, but it wasn't the soft glow of the Watcher's Gate. It was harsh, unnatural, a red so deep it looked black. Heat radiated from the crack, warping the air and making the shadows around them crawl like they were alive. Merritt gripped Tafari's wrist. This isn't balance. This is wrong. He didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't know what to do. All his life, he had thought his destiny was to restore peace, to right the wrongs of the past, to fix what Sedekare had broken. But what if that idea had been just another piece of the lie? What if everything, the dreams, the visions, the marks, was just part of this ancient plan to reopen a prison disguised as a prophecy? Behind them, Amunef stood trembling, his voice barely a whisper. This isn't just the Watchers returning. This is the ones they locked away, the ones they sacrificed themselves to trap. Figures began to emerge from the second gate. At first, they looked like smoke, formless and writhing. But then they stepped through the crack and solidified. Twisted reflections of the Watchers, taller, darker, their eyes like pits, their movements jagged and impatient. These are not memories. These were not gods. These were devourers. The Watchers around the valley retreated further. Some simply vanished. Others remained frozen, pulsing faintly like they were trying to resist, trying to hold back the flood. But it was too late. The sky dimmed again, the stars swallowed by something vast and unseen. Tafari stepped toward the masked figure. Why now, he asked. Why return now? And the answer came not in words, but in sensation. Because now you remember. It hit him like cold water. This wasn't just about gates. This wasn't even about Sedekare. It was about memory. Long ago, the ancient priests and bridge keepers had bound the second gate with a kind of forgetting. The world had to forget the devourers existed. That was the only way to keep them locked away. And the Watchers, in turn, had sacrificed their names and their worship so the greater threat would never return. But time had worn away the seal. And now, Tafari, chosen, marked, opened, had become the final piece needed to remember. The crack widened. The heat intensified. The devourers spread into the valley, and the earth beneath their feet turned gray and cracked like ash. One reached toward a nearby Watcher, and in a blink, that Watcher collapsed inward, imploded, its form folding into itself with a scream that never made it to sound. Merritt turned to Tafari. We have to stop this. How? He asked, voice hoarse. We opened it. I opened it. No, she said, shaking her head. Not on your own. They led you here. All of it. The Watchers. The dreams. The priests. They needed someone to remember just enough to bring back the wrong thing. Tafari stared at the six-pointed map, still glowing beneath their feet. The final mark, the living one, was flickering now, unstable. Cracks were forming along its edges. If that symbol died, if it faded entirely, so would the bridge. And if the bridge fell, the devourers wouldn't just escape. They would overwrite. Across Egypt, the signs were now visible to all. People dropped to their knees in the streets. The Nile bubbled and turned a sickly color near its edge. Birds flew in erratic panic patterns. Animals ran from the cities. And above it all, the sky groaned. A low, steady rumble like an enormous heartbeat that no one wanted to hear. The priests who had served Sedekare dropped their hoods in unison. Their eyes were dark and hollow, not from corruption, but from surrender. They had never truly followed the Pharaoh. They had followed this. They had waited for centuries for the right soul to open the forgotten gate. And now they had him. But they hadn't counted on Pharaoh still being himself. He stepped away from the masked figure, the light on his chest now sparking wildly. "If I opened it," he said aloud, "then maybe I can close it." Amunef shook his head. "You're marked. You're tied to the gates now. If you try to seal it, you might go with it." Pharaoh looked at the twisted devourers pouring into the world. The cracked sky, the trembling earth. "If I don't, there won't be anything left of us to save." Merritt stood beside him. "We'll hold the line, whatever that means. You just find the lock." He dropped to his knees and placed his palms flat against the sixth symbol. It burned beneath his touch, not with pain, but with truth. Visions rushed through his mind, not dreams this time, but memories that weren't his. The moment the first gate was closed, the sacrifice of thousands, the silence that followed, and the second gate, buried deep in the oldest part of the land, sealed not with stone or magic, but with forgetting. To close it, he would have to unremember, to wipe it from the minds of all who had seen it, including his own. The stone pulsed once more. He leaned forward, and then he heard Merritt scream. He turned in time to see one of the devourers racing toward her, its form blurring with unnatural speed, mouth stretched wide. A watcher threw itself in front of her, intercepting the attack, collapsing instantly into black mist. But another devourer followed. Then another. Amunef grabbed a fallen staff and struck one of the creatures, shouting words in a language he barely knew. The blow passed through it, but the creature stopped for a moment, confused. They could be stalled, distracted, but not defeated. Tafari's hands sank deeper into the glowing stone. "Come on," he whispered. "Show me how." And slowly, the ground answered, not with light, but with silence. A perfect silence. And in that silence, he saw it. The knot, the center of all gates. The first word ever spoken in the old tongue, the word that meant close. But as he reached for it, the masked figure stepped in front of him. It no longer needed to speak. Its presence screamed "No," and Tafari realized something terrifying. He wasn't the only bridge. The masked figure stepped closer, its feet gliding over the glowing stone like it had no weight at all. Tafari froze, his hands still pressed to the surface, his fingers only inches from the symbol that pulsed like a final heartbeat. Behind him, the devourers swarmed the edge of the valley, their long limbs slicing through the air, tearing apart the silence, driving the last remaining watchers into retreat. Merritt and Amunef held their ground, barely, their voices hoarse from calling out lost chants that no longer had the power they once did. And yet they fought, because giving up meant letting the darkness take it all. The masked figure tilted its head. Its face, cracked gold and shadow, reflected the storm of light rising around them. And without a word, it lifted its hand and placed it directly over Tafari's. The stone flared. A deep rumble tore through the valley floor, splitting the ground further. Tafari cried out as something surged through him, like two rivers crashing together. One of memory, the other of force. The gate beneath him trembled, but instead of closing, it yawned wider. A second bridge, a second key. Sedekar had never just been a pawn. He had been a mirror, a twin path carved through time. While Tafari had been chosen to seal the gate, Sedekar's line had been marked to unlock it fully, permanently. And now, the echo of that ancient betrayal stood before him, completing the ritual. "You were never meant to stop this," the presence whispered into Tafari's mind. "You were meant to understand it." The weight of those words sank in fast. All the pain, the dreams, the marks, they weren't just guidance, they were lessons, preparing him for the choice he was now faced with. If he touched the closing word alone, he could seal the gate, but the devourers would remain, already loose in the world. If he let the masked figure complete the opening, the watchers and their enemies would pour in, and Earth would become a place between places, no longer fully human. But if he merged the two paths, if he allowed both keys, Sedekar's blood and his own, to collide, the gate wouldn't open or close. It would collapse, The Watchers, the Devourers, the history behind both. Erased. All of it. Even himself. Tafari looked up, the wind roaring around him, the sky flickering between colors that didn't have names. He saw Merit watching him from across the chaos, her eyes locked on his. She didn't say anything. She just nodded. She knew what he was about to do. So did Amunef, who dropped the staff and stood still, his lips parting in quiet understanding. This was the choice only Tafari could make. With every ounce of strength he had left, Tafari reached with his free hand and gripped the masked figure's arm. The contact sparked like lightning. The gate beneath them reacted instantly, the light splitting down the middle, forming a spiral of symbols that began to twist inward, collapsing toward the center. The masked figure resisted, trying to pull away, but Tafari held fast. The two forces, open and close, clashed violently. The ground screamed. The sky bent. Time itself wavered. The Devourers shrieked, losing form, pulled backward like water retreating through a crack. The Watchers screamed too, not in pain, but in protest. Then, with a final, thunderous pulse, the gate snapped inward. Not shut, not sealed, gone. It was like it had never been there. The valley went silent. The sky cleared. Stars returned to their rightful places. The Watchers were gone. So were the Devourers. The symbols on the ground vanished. The glowing map reduced to dust. Only Merit and Amunef remained, breathless, blinking through the fading light. And Tafari? He was gone. No sound, no flash, just gone. For a long time, Merit stood at the place where the symbol had once glowed. She knelt and pressed her palm to the cold stone. Nothing happened. The mark was gone. I think he did it, she whispered. I think he broke the cycle. Amunef nodded, still staring at the sky. But at what cost? Days passed, then weeks. The skies stopped shifting. The people in the capital slowly came back to themselves, with no memory of the march, no sense of the horrors that had nearly crossed into their world. It was as if a terrible dream had lifted, leaving behind only calm and confusion. The temple walls cracked on their own. The statue of Sedekir crumbled into fine sand, and the sixth symbol was never seen again. Until one night, months later, Merit stood alone by the Nile. She saw a figure across the water, standing at the edge of a small hill. Cloaked, silent. He didn't move. He didn't wave. But she knew. Tafari had made the final sacrifice, but not in the way anyone expected. The gate hadn't destroyed him. It had held him. Somehow, in sealing both past and future, he had become part of the land itself. The bridge was gone, but its guardian remained. The figure across the water didn't move. He stood still, shadowed by the faint silver moonlight, barely more than a silhouette against the calm waves of the Nile. Merit stared at him, heart pounding. She didn't call out. She didn't dare. She only watched. The night was quiet, too quiet, like the whole world had paused to let her see him. A single breeze passed between them, brushing her hair back from her face and stirring the grass along the bank. The figure remained silent. And then, slowly, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness just as gently as he had appeared. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Merit returned to the valley. Amunef had refused to come. He said he'd had enough of gates, enough of watchers, enough of prophecy. He wanted peace, to rebuild what little they still understood. But Merit couldn't leave it alone. Something inside her needed to know if Tafari was gone forever or if something of him still remained. The valley looked ordinary now. No glow, no watchers, no markings, just cracked stone and dust. She wandered across the center, the very place where the sixth symbol had once pulsed beneath his hands. The stone was cool, silent. She crouched, brushing her fingers along the surface. And that's when she felt it. Not a voice, not a vision, just warmth. A soft pulse from beneath the ground, like a heartbeat. Faint, barely there, but real. She pressed her palm flat, holding her breath. For a moment, she felt nothing. And then a flicker, an image not seen but felt. Tafari, not standing, not walking, floating maybe, existing in the spaces between now and before. He wasn't in pain. He wasn't lost. He was waiting, or watching. The gate hadn't killed him. It had made him into something else. The bridge hadn't just been a person. It had always been a connection, a tether between the forgotten and the remembered, the living and the myth. And when Teferi chose to seal the second gate by collapsing both powers into each other, he hadn't destroyed himself. He had become the living seal, the memory that couldn't be erased. She stood, dizzy with the weight of what that meant. If he was still there, then someone, somewhere, might try to open the gate again. The threat wasn't gone forever. It was simply held back by one soul strong enough to bear it. Merit returned to the capital with a purpose. She didn't tell anyone what she'd seen. She didn't speak of the valley. But she went back to the temple ruins every week, rebuilding a new archive, not to worship the Watchers or remember Sedekir, but to record truth. Quietly, carefully, she wrote of a man born marked by visions. A man who saw what others couldn't, who felt time and memory pressing down on him until it broke him open. She didn't name him, but she told the story of the bridge, a bridge that had once been a boy. And in the final scroll, she left one line, hidden in the margin, only visible in the right light. Asterisk, if you feel the ground hum, walk gently. He is still listening. Asterisk, the seasons passed. The temples fell further into ruin. The people forgot again, slowly, gently. And one night, many years later, a child was born under a red moon. She never cried. She only stared at the stars with wide, knowing eyes. And when she could speak, her first word was not from any known language. It was a name that hadn't been spoken since the gate was sealed. Merit's blood ran cold the day she heard it, because she knew what it meant. The bridge was listening, and the gate was watching. Merit stared at the child in stunned silence, her heart stuttering in her chest as the name echoed in the room like a long-forgotten melody. No one else seemed to understand its weight. Not the mother who had just given birth, not the midwife tending to her, not the elders gathered quietly outside the doorway. Only Merit felt the ground shift beneath her, like time itself had blinked. The girl's eyes were wide and unusually calm for a newborn. They locked on Merit's face, and something about the gaze made her knees weak. It wasn't just recognition, it was memory, like the child knew her, as if looking straight through her into the past, into the valley, into him. Merit didn't speak the name aloud. She couldn't, not yet, but it repeated in her mind, pulsing gently like a drumbeat in the distance, calling her back to the place where everything had changed. That night, she walked alone along the Nile again. The stars above were sharp and clear, but her mind swam with questions she couldn't answer. Was this child a warning, a beginning, or something else entirely? The silence around her deepened as she reached the old path to the valley. It had been years since she'd come this way, and nature had slowly begun to reclaim it. The grasses were taller, the stone markers worn down by wind and time. But the center of the valley still felt different, untouched by erosion, unbothered by the years. The air was still, heavy, charged with the same strange hum she'd felt the day Teferi disappeared. She knelt again, placing both hands on the smooth stone where the sixth symbol once glowed. Her fingers tingled. A faint warmth spread into her palms. The gate was still gone, but the bridge was still here. And he knew. A soft whisper rose around her, not from outside, but within. No words, just a sensation. Teferi's presence, gentle, patient, aware. He was watching, not bound like a ghost or trapped like a prisoner, but present, part of the fabric now, interwoven with the memory of the land, with the sky and the sand and the breath of the river. She closed her eyes and saw the girl again, eyes glowing faintly in the firelight, speaking that single, ancient name like it had always been hers. The Watchers had been forgotten, the Devourers sealed. But time remembered everything. And in time, everything tried to return. Merit returned to the capital and visited the girl's mother the next morning. The house was quiet, peaceful. The child rested in a carved basket near the window, bathed in golden sunlight. Her little fingers twitched as if brushing the edge of a dream. "Have you named her?" Merit asked. The mother looked up with a soft smile. "Yes," she said, "but I don't know where it came from. It just felt right." like it was already hers before I spoke it. Merit nodded slowly, her throat tight. "May I hold her?" The woman handed the baby over, and Merit cradled her gently. The child was light, warm. Her tiny hand curled around Merit's thumb, and for the briefest second, Merit felt something surge through her. A memory. Not hers. His. It was the moment before the gate collapsed. Tafari, standing at the center of everything, staring into the abyss beyond time. The decision. The pull. The sacrifice. And then, a final thought, offered like a seed to the winds. Asterisk. If I must go, then let me return as a whisper. A chance. A reminder that the gate is never truly gone. Asterisk. The baby blinked once, and the memory vanished. But the meaning remained. She wasn't Tafari reborn. She wasn't a copy, or a curse, or a prophecy. She was something new. A vessel not of the past, but of balance. Born under a silent sky to a world that had forgotten its ghosts. And when the time came, she would be the one to choose what opened and what stayed closed. Merit knew she had a role to play now, not as a seer, not as a scribe, but as a protector, a teacher. The old stories had to live somewhere, even if they were buried deep, waiting for the right eyes to find them. She would pass them down, not as facts, not as warnings, but as songs, as whispers hidden in lullabies and carvings and the rhythm of footsteps through sand, so that when the girl was ready, she would know how to listen. Years passed. The child grew, curious, quiet, drawn to places others avoided. She never feared the valley, nor the old symbols carved into stone. She would trace them with her fingers like they were part of her skin. And sometimes, when she slept, her mouth moved silently, whispering words no one understood, except Merit, because Merit remembered too. One day, when the child was 12, she wandered alone to the edge of the valley. The skies had darkened slightly that morning, not with storm clouds, but with a soft, eerie dimming, like the world was bracing for something it couldn't name. The girl stood at the place where the sixth symbol had once pulsed. She placed both hands on the stone, and the earth beneath her responded with a single, quiet beat. A pulse. Faint. Familiar. Tafari. Not calling out. Not warning. Just watching. And somewhere, not far away, in the places where time folds in on itself and memory becomes more real than stone, a presence smiled. Because the gate may have closed, but the bridge was never broken. It had simply changed. The girl didn't speak of what she felt that day in the valley. She kept her hands pressed to the stone for a long time, eyes closed, breathing softly. The pulse beneath her palms wasn't loud, wasn't urgent. It was steady, like the slow heartbeat of the earth itself. She felt it travel through her arms and settle in her chest. A warmth she couldn't explain, but didn't question. She knew, somehow, that this place wasn't just a ruin. It was part of her story, and whoever was watching from the silence, they weren't a stranger. When she finally opened her eyes, the sky had returned to its gentle blue. Birds chirped in the distance. The breeze moved the tall grass around the edge of the stones. It was as if the world had taken a deep breath and let it out slowly, calming itself. She stood and walked home, but something inside her had shifted. She didn't understand it fully. Not yet, but she would in time. Merit watched her closely in the months that followed. The girl began to ask questions about old places, forgotten names, strange dreams. She would wake up some nights with words on her lips that Merit had once heard carved into the temple walls. Ancient phrases, keys, pieces of songs long buried. Merit recorded them quietly. In a new book she kept hidden from even the elders. She didn't write them as facts or predictions. She wrote them like seeds, waiting for the right season. The elders noticed the girl's behavior too, though they didn't understand it. They whispered about her strange eyes, about how the animals in the village never shied away from her, how the wind always seemed to shift when she passed. They began calling her the still child, not out of fear, but awe. They didn't know why, but they sensed something deeper lived just beneath her surface, something older than memory. One morning, the girl sat beside the river, drawing spirals in the mud with her fingers. Merit approached, and sat quietly beside her. The girl didn't look up. "I saw him," she said. Merritt didn't ask who. She already knew. "Was it a dream?" the girl asked softly. "No," Merritt replied. "Not just a dream." The girl nodded, as if she already expected that answer. "He's not gone." "No," Merritt said. "He's part of everything now." They sat in silence, the river murmuring beside them. The girl looked at her reflection in the water, then down at her hand, tracing the faint lines of her palm. "He left something behind," she whispered. "Not just the seal." Merritt looked at her, uncertain. "What do you mean?" The girl pressed a hand to her chest. "I can feel it. It's like a doorway, but not open. Not yet. It's quiet inside me, but it's there." Merritt's breath caught. It made sense now, why the Watchers and Devourers had vanished so completely, why no one remembered the great collapse of the Second Gate. Teferi hadn't just stopped them. He had absorbed them, pulled the truth of both forces inward, locked it within a memory that would live on not in stone or scroll, but in a human heart. The girl stood and brushed the mud from her fingers. "He said it's not time yet." Merritt frowned. "He spoke to you?" "Not with words. But I understood." Merritt stood too. "And what happens when it is time?" The girl looked up at the sky. Then she smiled. "I think I'll know." From that day forward, Merritt began preparing in a different way. She no longer wrote just for herself. She began carving symbols into stone again, but in different places, quiet, secret corners of the village, beneath bridges, behind old doors. Not to open gates, but to guide, to remind, to create anchors for a future moment that might come quietly, like the first drop of rain before a storm. Because now she understood, Teferi had never wanted to return as a god or spirit. He had become something gentler, something more human. A tether, not a master. And the child, she was not his vessel. She was his echo. And echoes, when followed, always lead back to the source. One night, the girl walked alone into the valley again. This time, she carried something in her hand, a small stone carved with one of the ancient symbols. She didn't know what it would do, only that it belonged there. She placed it at the center of the field where the sixth symbol had once burned, then sat beside it. She didn't speak. She didn't pray. She just waited. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just before dawn, the wind shifted, and in the distance, a light flickered along the edge of the hill. Not from the gate, not from the sky, but from within the earth. A soft shimmer, like the land was remembering something. The girl watched it, heart steady. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The shimmer faded slowly, like a breath being released, and the ground went still again. The message was clear. Not yet, but soon. And when the time came, she would be ready. Because the bridge hadn't broken. It had simply changed hands. And the gate? It wasn't locked. It was resting, waiting for a new question, waiting for her answer. The morning that followed was quiet, and the girl walked back to the village with slow, thoughtful steps. She didn't tell anyone about the shimmer in the valley or the way the ground had seemed to breathe beneath her. She didn't need to. Whatever it had been, it wasn't meant for the world yet. It was still finding its way through her. People greeted her kindly as she passed. A few old men at the well gave her respectful nods. One elder even smiled and said, "Strange dreams last night." Felt like someone was listening. She smiled back, but said nothing. The village had grown used to her presence over the years. What once seemed unusual now felt quietly special. The animals followed her more closely. The children listened when she spoke, even when she said very little. There was no fear around her, no whispers anymore. Just this growing sense of trust, like everyone had slowly come to feel that she was part of something they couldn't explain, but instinctively respected. And they were right. Merritt sat by the window of her home, watching the girl from a distance. Her hair had grown long, and her steps were more certain now. Merritt saw herself in her sometimes, but not in a way that made her feel replaced. Instead, it gave her peace. The questions she'd once carried like weights on her shoulders were lighter now. The answers hadn't come all at once. They'd come gently, in moments like this, in quiet walks, in shared glances, in silence filled with meaning. That night, Merritt lit a small lamp and opened the final scroll she'd kept hidden beneath the stone floor of her room. It was old, the edges frayed, the ink faded from years of quiet handling. She reread the first line she'd written when she thought the world was ending. Asterisk, he is not gone. He is the bridge, and the bridge is memory. Asterisk, she added one last sentence before rolling it up. Asterisk, and memory lives on, not in walls or in gods, but in those who choose to remember softly. Asterisk, she tucked the scroll away, knowing it would be found when it was needed. Years passed. The valley became part of the land again. No symbols returned. No gates reopened. But something about the place still felt sacred. People began to come there quietly, not to pray, but to listen, to reflect. They said it was the silence that made it special. The wind never howled there. Birds never cried overhead. Even footsteps seemed softer on that ground. The girl, now a young woman, returned often. She no longer needed signs or dreams to guide her. She simply knew. Sometimes she sat at the center of the field and hummed songs no one had taught her. They weren't old chants or ceremonial hymns. They were gentle, wordless melodies carried by instinct, shaped by memory. And though she sang alone, it never felt lonely. One day, while sitting beneath a tree near the valley's edge, she found herself thinking of Tafari, not as the man from the stories, not even as the echo inside her, but as a friend. A quiet guardian who had left the world softer than he found it. His sacrifice hadn't made him distant. It had made him present, woven into every calm breeze, every choice to listen instead of speak, every moment someone chose peace over power. It was then she understood the deeper truth behind the story. It had never really been about gates or pharaohs or ancient wars. It had always been about balance, about remembering and forgetting, about when to hold on and when to let go. The watchers, the devourers, the echoes, they were all part of a cycle, but the bridge had always been the moment where choice lived. And now, that choice was hers. Not to open, not to close, but to wait, and when the time came again, to choose gently. She stood and walked back down to the stone where she'd once placed the carved token. It was still there, now covered in moss, worn by years of rain and sun. She picked it up, dusted it off, and smiled. Then she whispered, "Not today," and placed it back, far away, under the Nile, under the dust of forgotten tombs and the dreams of kings long buried. Something stirred. Asterisk, not asterisk in anger, not in unrest, but in recognition. The gate did not open. It simply listened and chose to rest. The village continued to thrive. The stars kept their place. And the story of the bridge became one more quiet tale passed from mother to child, from stone to sand, from silence to song. And though the world would change, forget, and change again, somewhere in the quiet places where memory hums just beneath the surface, the bridge remained, watching, waiting, and when the world was ready, it would know the way.